So welcome listeners, viewers and online guests to this, the first in our series of Safe to Trade webinars. I'm your host, Kelvin Wood. I'm a consultant environmental health practitioner here at Safe to Trade. And over the coming months, we have a very special programme of topics and updates, providing you all you need to know about the scheme. So thank you for those who are joining us live today in this virtual forum, and also a welcome to those who are watching pre-recorded afterwards. At the end of our discussion today, we are going to have the opportunity for any guests to ask any questions of myself and our guest, John, in the chat pane. So just a little bit of housekeeping. It won't be interactive in that way of putting up your hand and asking a question. Just type your question into the chat box, and then at the end of the discussion, we'll field some of those questions to our guest, and as many of we have time for. So speaking of guests, today I am delighted to be joined by one of the founders of Safe to Trade. It's my pleasure to introduce you to John Barnes, chair of our stakeholder engagement group at Safe to Trade and former head of local delivery at the Food Standards Agency. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Kelvin.
How are you this morning?
I'm fine. I'm fine so far.
Lovely, lovely. Good stuff. John, for the benefit of those people who haven't met you before, please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, thank you and good morning to everybody. Yes, well, I think according to the flyer, I'm a seasoned professional. You are the entertaining host. I'm a seasoned professional. I don't know how that came about, but I actually am also an environmental health officer by profession. I spent the early part of my career in local government and then working in industry. I moved in the 90s to the Department of Health in their general food hygiene branch, and then at its inception and launch in 2000 to the Food Standards Agency, where I sort of worked my way through the various jobs until in the end I was head of local delivery. So that's responsible for things like the introduction of the food hygiene rating scheme, industry guides, the food hygiene regulations. Since leaving the Food Standards Agency, I've worked with a number of organisations, international and national organisations, on food safety compliance, and also with WHO and the UN on public-private partnerships, in particular, linking and using things like voluntary third-party assurance to actually help focus regulatory resources. So I think my whole career has been spent trying to ensure that food is safe. And I like to think that Safe to Trade is, and my involvement is, an extension to that.
Absolutely. We're delighted to have you, John. So today, as I said, this is the first in a series of webinars. So we thought it only right and proper to start at the beginning. We're going to give you an introduction to Safe to Trade. We're going to take things back, talk about what the scheme is, how it came about, and what it actually means to the regulatory community, to food business operators, and to consumers themselves. So let's start. John, tell us a little bit about why a scheme like Safe to Trade is seen to be required and what's changed in the industry prompting voluntary third-party assurance schemes such as this one.
Okay, well, firstly, let's look at what hasn't changed. What hasn't changed is that food businesses need to operate safely and need to provide safe food, and I think need to have confidence that they're able to do that. So that hasn't changed. But as I think my introduction alluded to, I've been around the block a fair bit. I actually think we're in as challenging a time for the industry and for the regulators as I have witnessed. And I've been around for Listeria, Salmonella, the sort of horse meat problems, BSE. So, I mean, this is challenging. Customer expectations are very high, and they're particularly high for things like hygiene and safety and public health following the pandemic. But also there's changes to the industry, challenges like staffing. That's increasingly difficult, keeping on staff, and therefore the problem of making sure they're trained. Expectations for things like allergens that have to be absolutely top rate in food businesses. The customer and the regulator will be unforgiving if one gets problems there. I think there are operational challenges with regard to online changes and the changes that are necessary operationally. So, you've got all of those changes. You've got actually increasing numbers now of food businesses coming through, starting again after the pandemic. And they've got to contend with things like how you deal with waste, energy, and all sorts of other shortages, including staff. So you've got that. And on the other hand, you've got regulatory resources diminishing at the same time. They're really not getting around to businesses as they used to. And they really haven't picked up fully. They've done a great job, but haven't picked up fully after the pandemic. But there's now a much greater expectation by regulators that businesses can demonstrate their compliance. Yeah. And that if they are able to demonstrate their compliance, they will recognize that in their frequency or intensity of inspection, so that they're able to target their resources on businesses that actually aren't really investing in hygiene and have good systems in place. Coupled with that, there are new sentencing guidelines so that the industry, particularly those with a large turnover, fines are now in the food safety and hygiene area proportional to their turnover. And that means they can be very big, up to £1 million an offence. So businesses really need to invest in food safety systems, not only because of regulation demands, but also because they have to protect their customers. And really, they have to go to bed at night not worrying themselves silly that actually they've got all sorts of risks there. So they need to be confident that they're being addressed and looked after. That is where Safe to Trade comes in. That is where Safe to Trade, I think, is an effective system, a comprehensive system that actually enables businesses to get things right in a way, in a simple way, that actually enables them not only to do that, but to focus on what they're there to do, which is a hospitable environment for their customers.
Wonderful. Thanks, John. And from your perspective, looking back at your time with the FSA, you were so instrumental in bringing us the food hygiene rating scheme. Why is Safe to Trade seen as required kind of in collaboration or in parallel with the food hygiene rating scheme? It's already out there. We've already got it. It's up and running. It's very successful. How does Safe to Trade build on that?
Well, yeah, and the first thing I'd say is this is not a replacement for the food hygiene rating scheme. I actually say I've got some skin in the game there. No, this is to complement the food hygiene rating scheme. The food hygiene rating scheme is great, and it's got a good profile, and it stands there about hygiene. It's like a window into the kitchen. Safe, however, what it doesn't do is it doesn't really properly cover allergens and the changes to the regulations there. It doesn't cover labeling and food content and things like food fraud that are incredibly important now to businesses and to customers. And there are all sorts of challenges presented to businesses to really get things on labeling and description right. Or in fact, there are drivers to sort of encourage them maybe sometimes to get things wrong and to over egg the pudding. And it doesn't include things like front of house, which post-COVID are incredibly important to customers. They want to feel safe when they go into businesses. So things like Safe to Trade are there with a sticker, which actually say to the customer, the business has gone the extra mile to ensure their safety. And that extra mile is important to the business because it actually includes checks and making sure they've got things right on incredibly important things like allergen controls, front of house, labeling, and potentially things like food fraud, or at least misrepresenting food. So that's why it's important in the first instance. The other thing is, of course, the food hygiene rating scheme has come under tremendous strain. Regulators aren't getting around as much as they ought to. Some of the ratings can be historic. I hope that will sort of pick up, but it could be that these compliant businesses are only looked at now every 2, 3, for years, and local authorities sort of rightly focus on those lower rated businesses. So safe to trade is something that businesses can have an approval annually that actually not only will show their customers and themselves that they can have confidence in the food, but also they know that if they've got a safe to trade, they're, you know, bang on target to get a 5 if and when the local authority comes around to look at their businesses.
Yeah, that's the danger, isn't it, John? That 5 that's on the window, on the door from the food hygiene rating scheme, Joe Public walking by will have no way of knowing that it's been there for 5 years. You know, they're not like us, they won't look on the sticker with a little date on it. They kind of would take it at face value, which is intended to be. So that kind of check-in against your official rating that you get through Safe to Trade is really valuable for food business operators and consumers, I guess. So now we kind of established a need, let's have a look a little bit about Safe to Trade itself. So how did it come about, John?
Well, actually, it came about during the pandemic. That I think everybody, when businesses started to close, people, you know, were very concerned. But, you know, I was working with a number of organisations, and I think it was pretty clear that, you know, the businesses weren't closed because there was a food safety problem, which is, in the past 30 years of my career, that's how businesses got closed in the past. They were closed because of the pandemic, but it meant that I think people would be nervous and anxious about going into businesses once they started to open. And also, really, you know, when they did open, you did not want a food safety problem in the food supply chain. I'm grateful that actually, you know, hats off to the industry, we didn't. You know, they actually managed the situation very well indeed, considering there wasn't really much regulatory oversight for that, for the duration of that. So Safe to Trade was born out of the need to reassure customers that they could go into businesses safely with regard to just COVID. And it was also there because everything was changing so quickly for industry, they couldn't keep pace. They needed to reassure themselves that have they got the ventilation right? Have they got the distances right? Have they got the controls right? The hygiene stations right? And that is where, you know, having professionals at the beck and call on a telephone helpline, being able to do a risk assessment, checking that everything was okay, training their staff properly, ensuring they're on top of things and that they could open safely. I like to think it was reassuring to businesses as much as to customers. And then to put a sticker to say, look, we believe we're safe to trade, and somebody else has independently checked that. And that worked very well indeed. Local authorities liked it. Some of them started to look to adopt it. And then once the COVID pandemic sort of concluded mercifully, although I'm just getting over about myself, we morphed it into food safety because we thought, well, look, there's a need now for a similar sort of scheme. We saw how successful it was with COVID. Why don't we produce not a COVID standard, but a food safety standard and apply it to businesses? Because we could see that actually, again, so much was changing, expectations were sky high, and actually local authorities were looking for industry to actually, good industry, to look after itself and to sort of regulate with the small r itself. And they could recognize that and target their resources elsewhere. So that was the origin, but also at the same time, as I alluded to in my introduction, I worked with the agency where we had voluntary third-party schemes, and this is what this is. This is a third-party assurance scheme where you've got a standard that applies to a business and it's independently checked, and you're given, audited, and you're given approval. Those schemes run in the UK. Things like the Red Tractor and such like across feed and dairy. And they're actually used by local and national regulators to help target their resources. So they don't target fully those businesses that are part of these schemes. They might look at a few of them, but they don't have to look at everyone. They're able to target those that haven't got this sort of voluntary third party, this robust assurance above it. So those schemes are in place. They're actually now part of modernisation programs across the globe. Regulators are looking at these industry schemes to see if they can recognise them in how they target their enforcement, and also get data from them, even if it's anonymised data, in order to see what's going on and what's going wrong or what's going right across the industry, to know where the risks are. So, that's where we were. And it was quite clear we'd got nothing in the hospitality sector, where there's 400,000 businesses, an awful lot of private checks going on, including by companies like Shield, Food Alert, NSF, but all to different standards, and there was no transparency to those standards, and probably no accreditation to some of those standards in the hospitality sector. So I don't think that industry, regulators, or consumers were deriving the right value out of it. So really, this was about, lifting, having a scheme, making sure it was robust, transparent, and that it could be used with confidence by businesses and considered with confidence by regulators. And actually, it has a fact, which we might go into later, where customers and consumers can feed into it, which is an important component to say, well, yeah, I went in there and it was great, or I went in there and I thought that this could be improved. So it's got a sort of virtuous circle of customer and staff feedback to actually ensure that it remains relevant and robust.
Indeed, that's very much a follow through from the COVID scheme of having that, a real-time register, and people can find themselves revoked from the register if we have customer feedback and there's an investigation that takes place and it is found that a business is no longer safe to trade. They will be removed from the register. Good. John, you've mentioned about this standard. For the benefit of the listeners, tell us a little bit about the standard, kind of what is it based upon? How is it kind of governed? Who's contributed to it?
Well, the standard is the most important thing, to any scheme. You want to make sure that it isn't ridiculously high, but it needs to cover everything that's important. So the standard is basically a standard that includes all the relevant food hygiene, food safety requirements, all the relevant industry guide sort of compliance standards that are there, that have been there for quite some time in the catering sector, which is a very good sort of document and approach. So it covers that. It also covers things like the new allergen regulations and controls. It also covers important things like food labelling and the like. So there's a technical standards committee that actually sits and ensures that that standard actually includes everything that it needs to include to ensure that the business is not only legally compliant on food safety and hygiene, but on all the other relevant things, including, reasonable front of house things. And that technical standards group is chaired by a colleague called Alec Kyriakides, ex of Sainsbury's, so it's got an industry basis there, a fellow of the Society of Food Hygiene Technology, and used to working with these schemes, in the British Retail Consortium and such like, and including also people like Hazel Gowland on the allergen side, and industry people and regulatory expertise to ensure that it fits the bill. That standard is constantly reviewed through that standards committee, and it's signed off by a governance board, an independent governance board that I sit on, that's chaired by Geoffrey Podger. I was actually going to say Sir Geoffrey Podger, but not yet. Geoffrey Podger, who was ex-chief executive of the Food Standards Agency, of the Health and Safety Executive, and actually of EFRA, the European Food Safety Authority, when it first came to be. So he's pretty good. You've got people like myself, I'm the poor relation. You've got Sterling Crew, and who most people will know Sterling, with an industry and local authority background, and also people like Selvarani Alahi, who's a deputy government chemist. So it's really to make sure it's honest and it's robust.
So some Big safety celebrities on the advisory groups and panels there, John.
Yeah.
How we mentioned that it's a fixed scheme, but it is undergoing constant revisions. Kind of what are the channels that people can offer feedback and have a look at the standard, see if it could be improved? How do we go about making those changes if required?
Well, like any scheme, I mean, the good thing about the scheme, there is a lot of trials and testing that came through from experience that we had with COVID, because how do we deal with the customer, the consumer feedback in a way that is, I think, right and proper for them, but also has the relevant safeguards for the food businesses themselves. So it's not just being launched now. I mean, it's gone through a number of years of activity, but always we have to keep it under review. Now, we would like there to be real buy-in from everybody, because I think that understanding what's going on and be able to contribute to it, I think, gives people sort of reassurance that it's on the right track, and it gives me reassurance it's on the right track. So we've got things like a Safe to Trade group in LinkedIn that people can sort of be part of, and we would hope not only to sort of feed useful information about the scheme into that, but also some additional information generally about food safety, so that there are advantages of being there. And we use that group to actually formulate a response to the recent Food Standards Agency's consultations on their new models for food standards enforcement and food hygiene enforcement, which, short advert, which I hope will give much greater recognition to schemes like Safe to Trade, or others indeed that are operating by industry, more recognition than it currently does with the old codes of practice, which, mea culpa, I must say, I was involved in. But things, of course, progress. So we've got that. There's also a forum that we have and that we run twice a year, where people from the group are able then to contribute to, I think it's really to ensure that we have a sort of 360-degree examination and review of what's going on. Any changes that we're thinking of making, are they right? Are they proper? Are they practical? Are they not enough? Are they too much? And that forum has, recognised people from the industry, from local authorities, at one point from the Food Standards Agency as observers, and from ourselves, from the governance board, and I chair that. And it's really important that the standard and the approach is live, that is relevant, that it responds to the changes, and that it takes on board things that might need changing in the standard or changing in the approach, but changing such that it's still a robust scheme, it's got integrity, and that's where the governance board comes in. I've got experience of these things, as many other people on there in other areas, to make sure that this is a scheme that can be trusted. Yeah. So to have safe food, you have to have trust. And to have trust, you have to have something that is credible. And that is where Safe to Trade comes in, I believe.
Yeah, and the standard itself has gone through a round of primary authority approved assured advice, has it not? And also as well, if you look at this standard in parallel, obviously we're not talking about taking away the legal requirement for businesses to have a food safety management system. That will always remain. But this standard has been created in a way that, like any accredited system, there are requirements, musts, that must be put in place and demonstrated by businesses to achieve this standard and become safe to trade. But it builds on that also as well, doesn't it, John? Businesses can demonstrate that they are going above the standard and implementing best practice almost.
Yeah. I think, well, firstly, Kelvin, you've drawn a very useful point, which is that this standard, this approach is assured under primary authority. So businesses can have confidence that if they are complying or conforming to the standard, yeah, that they should be, well above reproach by any other local authority, which is incredibly important for businesses that have sites, all over the place, and particularly if things are ever changing, and particularly with things like allergen controls, which are quite difficult and challenging to put in. So it's actually got assured advice, and that's quite important. But yes, the standard, I think that businesses, many of them, could overlay it on their system. So really it would refresh and enhance what they're doing. I don't think businesses that have actually got very good food safety management systems in place should worry about this. This will apply added rigor. It will be tech enabled that will help them with what they're doing and be able to demonstrate things more readily and ensure that the controls are put in place more efficiently and more effectively. But yes, there is that ability within standard to go above it. And, I think any standard needs to not only maintain food safety, but actually try and chase out improvements and some innovation. And that is something that can be recognised in the scheme. And it's something where we will give some further thoughts on how you might reward that in businesses, because I think it's incredibly important to acknowledge when people have gone the extra mile. But clearly, there will be an acknowledgement. The idea is that there will be a sticker that people can see. They can actually then contribute and say, well, I went in there and it was great. I went in there and there was a few issues. But I just know from experience, if you give people the opportunity to contribute, fun enough, they tend to do it quite positively. But if there is an issue, don't worry, they'll contribute one way or the other. And particularly with social media being what it is, and something like this gives them a channel in which to do it productively. And, I think that that's incredibly important also.
Yeah, and it doesn't just become a kind of a trip advisor for food safety in terms of people posting random comments. These are, comments and feedback that are investigated independently and impartially, if required, to actually give the general public confidence in the scheme. If we could just kind of finish in looking at some benefits for various stakeholders. Obviously, you've got the public themselves. We've got food business operators who would need to subscribe to this scheme. And then we've got the regulatory community. Can you tell us some advantages to those different stakeholders, John, of actually adopting Safe to Trade?
Yeah, well, I think for the food business, because it's a scheme. Well, it's a scheme for the food business, but it's there to protect the consumer. I think for the food business, I think they can be reasonably assured that they are confident that they are getting things right, that they are dealing with all the challenges and changes that are coming in. And they have got a system, their changes that they've made have actually been incorporated safely. So I think for them, it gives them confidence. It also gives their controls added value, that they are able to demonstrate to anybody that they have got a good system in place and have gone the extra mile, be that to a customer or a consumer at any stage, or particularly to the regulator. The benefits to the regulator is that they have a scheme here that has a standard that incorporates all the relevant food safety and regulatory requirements. And actually for environmental health officers, it also includes food standards elements, which is a particular issue with almost 50% less food standards officers now over the last 10 years than previously, and actually about 10% less environmental health officers by last knockings, that it actually is something that shows that businesses investing, they are contributing to ensuring that they're safe. So they can use and look at that scheme and those checks with confidence. So they can carry out inspections at a lower frequency, taking on board something that will come through, I'm sure, with the modernized regulatory modernized approach in the code of practice, which has just gone for consultation. And that they can look at the intent, they can do the intensity in a different way. So they can do that. They should also be aware that the auditors are at the highest level. the one thing about these schemes often is, well, how good are the auditors? How good are the checks? Well, these are basically environmental health professionals or people on that pathway registered so that these are people that could carry out inspections in a local authority and probably at a higher level than many that are carrying it out in a local authority. That's one of the main things we wanted to bring in. You can trust the auditor, you can trust the standard. And for customers, where they see that control, where they see that sticker, I think they can have confidence when they go in there that that business is safe and has gone the extra mile. If there was ever a problem, you can't eliminate risk entirely. I would say that this system would provide sufficient due diligence to show that they have gone the extra mile, they have taken the right sort of precautions. Something's gone wrong, and I hope it hasn't so far, but with all of these things, even with a FHRS 5, you have to acknowledge that that can happen. But this would be able to demonstrate, the business would be able to demonstrate that they have got due diligence, which would be massively important if ever there was a case against them, and hopefully it would prevent it in the first place. But it would, frankly, it would be gold dust if there ever was.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. I am conscious of our audience and our time. So as mentioned earlier, I would like to take the opportunity to ask if anyone's got any questions that they would like to ask the panel. Thank you to those who have already entered some into the chat panel. Let's just start off. I would give a shout out names and where people are, but a lot of them have been posted anonymously, so that's fine too. So question one, we mentioned about the COVID scheme. What was the kind of measure of success of the scheme during COVID?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I think one of the first things when we brought out the standard, the first thing was that the standard actually encompassed all the ever-changing requirements. So one measure of success is, well, when you audit or when the sort of check was carried out and the monitoring, the ongoing monitoring was provided back, were those standards conformed to, and indeed, did you have any regulatory, because there were still a few inspections to check the COVID precautions, or customer feedback, were things okay? Now, I would say, first of all, when it was first brought in, not many conformed to the standard. It was, even the larger sort of multi-site businesses found it quite challenging and difficult. So one of the first, I'd have probably had a bit of concern if everybody got through it first time, but actually then many didn't. And then as we looked through, we did a number of metrics to look at what sort of advice was being sought by businesses. What were the non-conformances seen? In the monitoring, were the standards being upheld? And we had a performance report provided monthly to the Independence Governance Board on that. And we also looked at not only the customer feedback, but when regulators went in there, did they find a problem? Was there an issue? Was there an outbreak to these businesses? So all of those were loaded into how we saw it. And there are a number of quite weird things. One of the things that we found was that where we were offering literally 24/7 telephone advice to businesses, we found some of the smaller businesses that weren't used to that, but probably needed it more because they weren't actually adhering to the standard. They really didn't use that advice. They weren't used to using that advice. We really had to push them, it's almost like pushing them to use free advice. Whereas the larger businesses that probably had a lot more in-house skills and were doing slightly better in the standard, even at the first knock-ins, they were using it more. So, I think that what we take into this scheme is how do we ensure that all businesses, make use of the professional support that is part of Safe to Trade. It's like having an environmental health department sitting behind you at all times. So I hope that provides some measure, but we were certainly mindful not to get it wrong. I can tell you that, because I felt I was sitting on top of something that could cause huge reputational damage, not only to safe to trade, but to me personally.
Yeah, you mentioned there about the kind of ongoing governance of safe to trade during the COVID scheme that has carried through to food safety, of the requirement for businesses to evidence-based close off non-conformances that were identified during the audit, and not until that has taken place with evidence that is verified, that safe to trade would be awarded. So that's a key part that has carried through to the food scheme. We've got another question here, which is a great question. Thank you to whoever asked this one. We have a number of businesses that, when you undertake a traditional food safety audit, will ask you to incorporate company specifics or operational processes into the audit set when you're going out, particularly in enterprise multi-location businesses. They're asking, is this included as part of safe to trade? Does it go into the standard, or would that be seen as separate consultancy?
I think that would, for me, that would be seen as something that's separate. I want to make sure that we've got a good core, but that's not to say you can't graft on those issues in any digital software system. That would be relatively easy. But the main thing is to make sure I've got no problem where those would go above and beyond, but they definitely wouldn't go below the standard. And because the standard is moving through for accreditation, there are set requirements that, I've got to be honest, even I sometimes raise my eyebrows at. But to ensure that it's something that's robust and credible, you have to make sure that there are these checks and balances. So as far as I am concerned, I have no problem with that at all, because we want to make sure that this applies to these businesses in a way that they feel comfortable. But the standard will run through it as a sort of I think a reasonably separate item. But you can do anything with the software nowadays. That won't be an issue.
Absolutely, yeah. The standard is fixed, and obviously there's mechanisms where people can contribute to the standard, but there is no tailoring to make it site-specific, customer-specific for an audit program. And as you just mentioned, moving through to it becoming an accredited standard, there is lots of impartiality rules about the kind of the consultancy aspect of delivering a safe to trade audit. So lots of controls in place from us to make sure it is controlled, it's rigorous, and it's not open to any kind of bias, be that from the auditors themselves through monitoring them on a register, or the customers actually feeding into what they want it to say. Thank you for that question. We have got a few people seemingly with the checkbooks open here who are wanting to know what is the cost to be part of the scheme. So in terms of that question, I think I will just defer to our marketing team who are on this call to make that information visible later on. But there are different prices for different sizes of business, and ultimately it would depend on the length of the intervention, the audit that is required from smaller businesses through to large, which will have an impact on the price. But all of that will be made visible offline after this.
I don't want to talk about cost here, but you're right. I mean, it's clearly we're giving strategic direction to this. One wouldn't want it to be prohibitive. And of course, it does depend on the length of time. What I would say is, without doing a fair sell here, I think for businesses that have got multi-site, I can assure you the cost of getting it wrong, and even if people don't find out, the cost of getting things wrong or putting in systems that just aren't robust, that don't work for you, are will be far, far higher. So, it certainly wouldn't be prohibitive, because that would just be killing it at birth. This is a scheme that I would love to be adopted, because I think its time has come. There is need for a scheme like this, a robust scheme across the hospitality sector that actually, can be used with confidence. Food safety is a shared goal between regulators and industry. It would be crazy to think it isn't. So the tram lines for modernized regulatory approaches now, if anybody has missed the work that's going on, it's about better use of data to target your controls. It's about working collaboratively with industry to actually take on board that shared responsibility and working collaboratively where you've got confidence in business, and it's about improving and increasing transparency of what those standards are or what the conformance and compliance levels are. That is where modernised regulatory delivery across the globe is growing. That is where the agency's ABC programme, that's inherent in what they're doing there. And this is responding to that sort of agenda. And I believe, if not now, when, for something like this.
Indeed. John, I think that's a beautiful way to wrap up there. I am looking at the time there, and that's all we have time for today. So, John, thank you very much for joining us today. We will be back next month with another Safe to Trade webinar. So thank you to our online guests for joining us this morning, and for those of you who've contributed in the questions. We will be posting this content onto our socials. So if you know any colleagues who weren't able to join us today but would be interested in viewing, please point them towards Safe to Trade's social media channels. And we look forward to joining you next month. So until then, have a great day. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
Thank you.